As most of you know, I have offered to you this summer for the sermon time as a change of pace, a feast of stories. Many of you might have recognized the stories, at least most of them, from camp. You might have heard Jim Bain or Larry Pigg or maybe one of the other regional ministers tell these stories. But I thought that for the last Sunday, for a summer of storytelling sermons, that I might offer to you, my beloved congregation, through the prompting of the Holy Spirit and a few very close colleagues, to offer you the story that I know very best, my own. First, let me assure you that this will not be the exhaustive account taking you through all my trials and tribulations, going through the trauma of having acne as a teenager, or all my favorite Broadway shows while living in New York City. I won't make you go through that. I also will not pick out one tiny aspect of my life and give you an excruciatingly close-up moment and detail of that, a la Cecil B. DeMille. But instead, I'll give you a quick look through one particular set of lens that I believe has informed me and, more importantly, my ministry more than anything else. And the second caveat, of course, is to say this is risky at best. Self-examination can always turn into self-obsession and ego. And you know, I fear that almost more than anything else. As with all my stories this summer, my prayer is, my hope is, to get us, each and every one of us, to think more critically about our own stories and ask those questions that are so compelling to us. Where has God been at work in and through my life, and where have I resisted that divine leading? How can I allow the Holy Spirit to blow through my life all the more so that I might more fully be an instrument of the divine? So, if you're willing, or maybe even if you're not, let's give it a try. I was born in Roswell, New Mexico in January of 1963. I was born just 3 months after my father, Lieutenant Colonel Wesley Dalton Harris, died of cancer of the throat. This is the hospital at which my mother worked, and this is the hospital where I was born. I don't want to make too much of my birth, but I was the longest baby ever born in that hospital, 24 inches. I was just shy of 10 pounds. I was just shy of 10 months. And, women, hold your breath, I was breech. It was humbling years later for me to go through my mother's correspondence, reading in the very same letter words of condolences on the death of her husband and words of congratulation on the birth of her son. I can't even imagine what my mother felt like in that time period. This is the picture that hung next to my mother's bed. This was my image of my father my entire childhood. I grew up fairly happy and content in a small southeastern New Mexico town, a location not chosen because my mom had family there, but because it was very close to my father's ranch that he had grown up on, and more important to him, it was near an Air Force base. He was an Army man. It was near an Air Force base, and he thought that they would have friends who were in the military who would understand them, and my mother could buy things very cheaply at the PX. Unfortunately, Walker Air Force Base would close the very next year, 1964, and my mother had neither of those. I grew up fairly happy and content in a small southeastern New Mexico town, but things really did not get interesting for me until I became a teenager. And two things happened during this time that would inform my life and my ministry. The first was that I became active in our church. This is First Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Roswell, New Mexico. I was in the youth group. I was a junior deacon. I sang in the choir, and I hung around the church office as much as I could after school doing anything the youth minister or secretary would tell me to do. I can run a mimeograph like nobody can. I love the smell of those old copiers. I'm sure that explains a little bit about my brain cells. I was a church geek of the highest order. Of course, this was the beginnings of my call to ministry. I did not know that then, but it was part of the reason people kept saying, "You're going to be a minister, right?" And I go, "Oh, no, I don't think so." But the second thing that happened was much more internal and gradual. I began to realize that I had rather strong and clear attraction to other boys, to men. And for those who claim that an honest, clear conversation about sexuality, whether in our schools or home or at church, or the presence of openly gay or lesbian persons in a child's life, caused them to consider homosexuality, I can tell you I had neither. And I'm 100% gay. Rather, what happens when these places do not have those conversations is that the culture was allowed to define my understanding of being gay, and it told me it was horribly wrong. That my natural feelings were something that needed to be hidden, that needed to be despised. Now, one moment stands out during this time period. This is the end of the 70s. It was during the Anita Bryant campaign to save our children. How many of you all know Anita Bryant? She was the spokeswoman and the face for Florida orange juice. A television news report on her campaign, which was Save the Children from Homosexuality, had a picture of two men sitting on a park bench with their arms wrapped around each other. What I noticed most about that picture was it was taken from behind. They couldn't show their face. Something in that picture, a fleeting moment on a television news program, made me very sad. Something in that picture implied that if I allowed myself to follow these inclinations, I would be forever lonely. That I would never have the things that were promised by our society that other boys and girls would have. And in that moment, and I cannot overstate, in that moment, sitting on the green shag carpet in my mother's house, with that news story about what Anita Bryant was doing, I vowed to repress with every fiber of my being anything that felt like a homosexual feeling. And if possible, I would destroy it. And I won't go into some of the ways I tried to destroy it. I wanted to be truly loved by my family, by my friends, by my church, and by the world around me. It would be 10 years, a decade of the most formative part of my life, before I would come out as a proud, happy gay man and begin to flourish. But I did. The summer, I went to Phillips University. And the summer after graduating from Phillips University was when I came out. Unfortunately, a lot of damage had been done by then, including a short and ill-fated marriage to an amazing woman who was my best friend in college and the only one I thought who would understand these complex things going on inside of me. But even coming out to myself and going through the trauma of that experience, that divorce, did not mean that homophobia wasn't still rampant in my life and in my heart. For I was heading off to seminary to be a minister. Oh joy, oh joy. And in 1985, the church was nowhere near being able to address the complex issues of sexuality and sexual orientation like it is today. Oh, wait. it's still not dealing with it well today. Sorry. But in 1985, I knew I had to tread lightly. So I entered Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas in the fall of that year as an out gay man, but who was still very closeted for employment. I served for 3.5 years at First Presbyterian Church in Grapevine, Texas, first as minister to youth and then associate to the pastor. It was an incredible experience, and so much of who I am, I attribute to working with this amazing woman, the Reverend Eleanor Kozad Cherry Holmes. If you were here on the 10th anniversary of my ministry at Franklin Circle Christian Church, you would have met her. She and her husband, who's now deceased, were with us that day. Eleanor was the only one in that church that I told I was gay, and she looked me in the face and said, "That has nothing to do with your ability to do good ministry. Go for it." But as my schoolwork drew to a close and my ordination process loomed closer and closer, I knew that it would not be within me to go through the ordination process closeted. I'd like to think it was because I had some strong willpower, but I thought that I just was not capable of keeping a secret that big to my next employer. So I chose to do what I believed was the honorable thing to do. 1 year before the Commission on Ministry would have to decide my candidacy, I asked, unusually so, for a conversation with the Commission on Ministry to tell them that I was gay. In 1988, you can only imagine what that conversation sounded like. At first, you could hear a pin drop. And then the accusations began to fly and fly without anyone holding them back. I was accused of burdening the church with my personal issue. I was told that they would make sure I would never work with children and youth again. One person even said that I would no longer be able to counsel a couple for marriage. David, did I do okay? Okay. Somehow I was incapable of doing any of these things. And I was sent on my way so the commission could then do its work to study the issue. In the intervening year in which I was given absolutely no word what was happening and no idea about the status of my future ordination, I learned later that they were calling in so-called experts on the topic. Jim Schimmel knows some of these folks, and I think he will tell you they were not experts. I learned that, but in the end, they decided not to decide. For what happened is I had also come out to my beloved church community, First Christian Church in Roswell. And after having met with them and their own angry accusations, I received a very terse letter in the mail from the Board of Elders, which, number one, said I was a troubled individual who should have counseling. I wanted to write back and say, counseling is what caused me to come out, and offer this information openly and honestly to you, but they wouldn't have taken that. But more pointedly, they withdrew their support for my ordination. And in the Christian church, Disciples of Christ, you need two things besides your call from God, of course, two things to be ordained and to serve in the church and have that recognized. One is the endorsement of your home congregation, and the second is the vote on the regional commission. The first was now withdrawn, so the regional commission on ministry's hands were clean, and they stepped back and said, we can do nothing without the ordination. And they informed me my candidacy for ministry and ordination ended. So I graduated in May of 1989 with my Master of Divinity degree. Here's some of my youth group members around giving me a very hard time. With no ordination, just a degree. I knew this was going to be a hard place to get a job. And in that last year, I spent a great deal of time meeting with regional ministers. For those of you who don't know, that's kind of the bishop level of our church. At least those who were kind enough to give me an audience. And I realized time after time, seeing these blank stares across the table, kind of faint smiles and occasional grunts or giggles, I realized that there was no chance in hell a single one of them was going to pass on my paper to anybody in that region, and no church would know my name no matter how hard I tried. So I took it upon myself to turn these meetings not into an interview for me to get a job, but rather a training session. And I trained quite a number of older, mainly white, mainly straight, as they told me, men, what it meant to be a healthy gay man who was stirred by the Holy Spirit, who wanted to walk in the way of Jesus, and who was called by God. I tried to laugh as often as I could because I cried too much at home. It was during this summer, between graduate school and the great unknown, that I went to the General Assembly of the Christian Church meeting in our denominational headquarters city, Indianapolis, Indiana. This was just a few weeks after having met a quirky and cute seminarian from Boston, a la Craig Hoffman, at the United Church of Christ General Synod in Fort Worth, Texas. He kept talking about a partnership between the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and the UCC. I had no idea how personal he wanted to make that partnership. He was even good enough to call me long distance the day before I left and wish me well as I headed off to Indianapolis. How sweet of him, right? Wrapping his tendrils around my heart. But at that General Assembly, I was almost literally a crazy man. So fearful that my call from God, that I'd gone through so much to discern, that my call from God would never be realized, at least in this, the church that I knew and loved. I wore a suit every day, not the usual attire for General Assemblies, especially during the summer. And I met with any pastor, regional minister, or search committee chairperson I could pin down for 5 seconds or more that would listen to part of my story. On one particular promising day, I made an announcement from the floor of the General Assembly about the next day's HIV/AIDS memorial worship service that we were having at each assembly. And at the end of my 1-minute announcement, I happened to tack on the line, "Oh, and by the way, I'm a seminary-trained pastor who is openly gay and I'm looking for full-time employment. Thank you." As I walked out of the assembly hall, I found a message on the noteboard waiting for me. It was from a pastor of a church in New York City. New York City? They can't even make salsa there. And he indicated that they were looking for an associate pastor and wondered if I would meet with a few members of that church while I was there. I did. And the rest is history. But what an amazing history it was. The church flew me out to New York for an interview, and then the search committee went immediately into hibernation. I didn't know what was going on, but much to the surprise of the committee, they liked me. They thought I was actually the best candidate for the job, but they were scared to death of the controversy that would accompany me. So, they set my profile aside and began to go through the profiles to find one more. They interviewed more people, just assuming that a better candidate would be found. A better profile would match what they were looking for. None did. And so, they flew me back for an interview series that lasted longer than a week. Now hear me. Normally, a pastor will come in, preach on a Sunday, a candidate, they'll vote afterwards, and then you'll find out by the end of the day. I not only preached, they had me work the Halloween booth. I was a judge doing a beanbag throw. I met with every conceivable group in the church. I met with the parents. I met with the Sunday school people. I met with the elders. I met with the deacons. I met with the trustees. I met with the fearful parents of the day school, a very elite thing. I think I even met with a group called Women Who Smoke Cigars and like to, I don't know, anyway. Most importantly was that meeting with the day school parents, because I would later learn that one of the elders had begun a rumor that if an openly gay man was hired on staff of the church, that this day school, which allowed the church, much like our endowment allows us to continue, the day school allowed that church to continue. It was a little bit like the tail wagging the dog. And she made it clear that we would lose all funding and day school parents would fly to the hills if a homosexual was on staff. But you know, no matter what other people said, every conversation I had was warm and rich and enlivening, and we learned so much about each other. So a few weeks later, after all the dust had settled, I received a phone call from the senior pastor, John Wade Payne, inviting me to join him on the staff of Park Avenue Christian Church in New York City. The U-Haul was packed before the phone was hung up. I began my ministry there at Advent of 1989, a most appropriate liturgical time to do so. But there was a confluence of world events that would soon overtake me and define my ministry from that point forward in very particular ways. The first was the AIDS crisis, which was bursting onto the world scene. And I was now living in the city that was both the epicenter of this horrendous epidemic and the epicenter of activism by those who needed treatment, respect, and care. ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, was finding its voice, confronting the powers that be on their silence in the face of one of the greatest health tragedies our world has ever known. And that silence was unquestionably due to the fact of, because of whom it was affecting: homosexual men, African Americans, and drug users. All seen as expendable by society. And one of the first campaigns and actions that ACT UP did was in December of 1989, Advent of the year I arrived, and was focused on the church's silence and complicity in the epidemic. Stop the Church was the campaign slogan. And posters were wheat-pasted all over New York City. I remember standing at a bus stop at night with Craig, looking, I remember the bus stop exactly, I know exactly where it was and what side that bus stop was plastered with. And I was horrified that here were these posters vilifying the very institution that I had spent the last decade of my life trying to get into. After years of fear and worry, I had become a part of the institutional church, and my own brothers and sisters were fighting this institution in which I was now fully invested. To say that I had mixed emotions would be to put it very lightly. Now, admittedly, most of ACT UP's ire was at the Catholic Church in New York City, and really most explicitly at Cardinal John O'Connor. But as a young gay minister looking at this huge outpouring of anger and rage, I could not make that distinction quite yet, and it confounded me totally. But it became clear to the pastor I was working with and the congregation I was a part of that what Christianity needed more than anything else was a model of church that actually followed in the words and ways of Jesus Christ. Honestly, clearly, and loudly. And that is what we began to do. The way we did it was to work to become an open and affirming congregation. I would end up co-founding the Open and Affirming Ministries program with Lori Riddell, a pastor from a Christian church in Seattle, Washington. Our job was to encourage, equip, inspire, cajole, and support congregations in our denominations to follow the ways and words of Jesus and to show God's love for all people, not just for some. And to be more honest about the complexity of the rest of the Bible that was being used so quickly and shamelessly to attack and disparage those who were on the margins and not like the majority, as it has been used throughout history, unfortunately. And it was here that the second great confluence of events would take place. In 1990, the name of the nominee for the position of General Minister and President was put forward for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ to vote on at the next General Assembly. It was somehow, and to this day we don't know how, made known that Michael Kinnaman here and his then wife Catherine Kinnaman were members of the Gay, Lesbian, and Affirming Disciples Alliance, the organization in which I was a leader and which promoted the Open and Affirming Congregation program. Michael would later tell you that when he and his wife wrote out that $40 check to become members, they did not think twice of it. They were not doing anything else with Glad Alliance, and they barely even thought it was worth noting. But somewhere in their minds, they thought, well, we should support that group. They sound kind of cool. Out of a church in Richmond, Indiana, thousands and thousands of letters were sent to every single congregation in the denomination. One letter to the pastor, and then to circumvent any of those liberal clergy, one letter to the chair of the Board of Elders. This letter accused Michael of being a homosexual sympathizer and made it clear that he was unworthy and unacceptable as a candidate for general minister and president because he promoted this sinful lifestyle. This caused Michael and the leaders of the church to have to go on a tour of the denomination, hosting meeting after meeting, which was supposed to give Michael a chance to explain his support for gay and lesbian folks. But in fact, what happened was that it gave horribly mean-spirited people a venue to spew their hateful venom at Michael. And the story he tells, I had forgotten until I read it 2 weeks ago, one of the worst moments was in Cleveland, Ohio. And since this was also the year that my name was being put before the Regional Commission on Ministry of the Northeastern Region, my name and Michael Kinnaman's name became woven together. We would become friends that year, and both of us would experience the Church of Jesus Christ at its absolute worst, and on rare but exquisitely beautiful occasions at its very best. One story of the church at its worst stands out for me. It was during a specifically called clergy meeting of the Northeastern Region, the Metropolitan New York City District. The senior pastor of my church, Park Avenue, and several of the elders accompanied me for a dialogue. In the midst of the dialogue, I was summarily castigated and chided for being a homosexual, and I love this, for being an uppity, talkative homosexual at that. Women, are we hearing echoes? And the height of the meeting involved a clergy colleague pronouncing me loudly and with finger pointing in my face as being worse than a whore, child molester, or addict. All three combined. I jumped from my chair, crying uncontrollably. I wasn't crying for my own sake as I ran from that room. Even then I had a pretty healthy ego and sense of self. I had heard this accusation dozens of times before. But what had never happened was that was waged against me in the front of these beautiful elders who had learned who I was, who I had come to know and love. And I hated the fact that in the midst of the beloved community, these beautiful people had to see this horrible side of humanity that I knew all too well. It almost broke my spirit. The upshot of that year for Michael was that his nomination was defeated by less than 1% of the 67% vote he needed to be elected. He would go on to do greater things, by the way. This was entirely due to the fact that busloads of anti-gay crusaders arrived the morning before the vote, registered that day as voting delegates, voted against Michael in the assembly hall, then boarded their buses for the trip home, leaving the assembly not only with a bloated quorum requirement that endangered all business after that point, but left us with this feeling of wretched violation and defilement that ate at the psyche and spirit of all of goodwill who believed the church could never do such a thing. It was in that spirit of brokenness that, not knowing each other at the time, the Reverend Jim Schimmel and I stood beside each other in a spontaneous choir that erupted in the assembly hall. Jim says he put out his hand and held the hand of a young person. I don't know who it was, but in my heart it was me. Singing out the pain and the dogged hope of a church afflicted in every way but not crushed. A church perplexed but not driven to despair. A church forsaken but not struck down. A church struck down but not destroyed. The upshot of that year was that after an extraordinarily painful and arduous ordination interview process, I was ordained into Christian ministry. What had happened was that the section of the Commission on Ministry that met in metropolitan New York had a tie vote. And let me note that the chair of the committee voted in order to make a tie. And if you know Robert's Rules of Order, that's exactly not what the chair should do. The chair should only break a tie. What that meant was that then the whole section of the whole Committee on the Ministry, that was broken in 3 sections because the region was so large, had to vote. I then traveled by train to Buffalo, New York, had a second full ordination interview with all the questions and all the accusations of the first one. Actually, that one was a little bit better. And then I would travel by train up to Boston and have a third ordination interview that was just as painful and horrible and beautiful. And by the time all the votes of the 3 sections were pulled together, I had enough to be confirmed for ordination. And the service of ordination took place on Sunday, May 19th, 1991 at a Jubilant Park Avenue Christian Church in New York City. There is much to the rest of the story, but suffice to say that subsequent to that date, most of what I've experienced has been what so many pastors have experienced. The ups and downs of congregations at the turn of a millennium, trying to do their best in the midst of a changing world. I can say that the call that this congregation extended to me on March 4th, 2001 was a pure joy and an affirmation that the Church of Jesus Christ can and will choose to follow the words and way of Jesus over the wiles and woes of we human beings. It was not completely easy here. If you recall,